Hey, welcome to Train Signal. You're watching Active Directory Certificate Services 101. Now, this is going to be just a short primer on Active Directory Certificate Services and Public Key Infrastructure. I got to tell you, this itself could be a 10-hour course. Okay, but I do want to give you at least a brief introduction to the terms that you're probably going to see on the certification exam and the basic overall theory that goes into certificate services. So, in this video, we're going to start off by talking about a little bit about security and what you can do with certificate services. Then we're going to talk about lions and tigers and keys and certificates. Oh my. Okay, so we're not really going to talk about lions and tigers, but I thought it was a fun title. So we're going to talk about keys and certificates, and we'll get our heads wrapped around those at least a little bit. In Respect My Authority, we're going to be taking a look at certificate authority servers and what those are. And then we're going to say, I'm sorry, Dave, I can't do that. Your certificate has been revoked. We'll talk a little bit about the revocation of certificates in case of security breaches and how certificates are validated. So let's start off by talking a little bit about security and what you can do with Active Directory Certificate Services. Security it's a huge thing, right? I mean, you can't go into any network without having to deal with security at some level. Now, a good place to start is on the inside of your network by using Active Directory Certificate Services. Now, by the way, this is an actual server role, okay, because it's a big deal. And we use it as a way to actually encrypt data files. We can encrypt remote communications when people are connecting from the outside world and to the outside world. We use it to secure email, a bigger and bigger deal every day with information theft as being what it is nowadays. Secure logons with smart cards. You can actually use certificate services with smart cards as well to allow users to prove that they actually are who they say they are by having that smart card. Also, we can secure servers with network access protection, which is a whole new topic for a whole different class. This network access protection, or NAP, as you're probably going to hear it called to referred to, does require certificate services to be running, but obviously securing servers is a really big deal. Protect data from tampering. Now, this kind of goes along with the encrypt data files, but there's another topic we're going to talk about in a video coming up where we start talking about rights management services, which can also use certificates. So Active Directory Certificate Services can actually enable us to do all of these things. But I got to tell you, it's not something that you can just whip together in an hour or a day. Using certificate services is going to take a lot of planning. It's going to take you a lot of time. So if your boss says, hey, why don't you just pop together a public key infrastructure and set us up with some certificate services real quick, go ahead and laugh in their face or turn in your resignation, because they don't understand that using certificate services is quite an undertaking. There's a lot of considerations that you need to stop and think about that just aren't part of the software side. Okay, I mean, there's a lot of stuff to it. Let's start off by talking about, though, what is a certificate, though. Okay, now we can use certificates to do all the stuff that I just told you about, but let's start off by talking about what a certificate is. It's just a file, but it contains a public key for encryption. I'm going to tell you about keys in just a minute, but a public key for encryption is basically an encryption algorithm, or a mathematical pattern, if you will, that allows us to encrypt files and unencrypt files and decode files, if you will. It also contains a digital signature for identification. It contains a name, which can be it can refer to a person, a computer, or an organization, a validity period, how long the certificate is good for, and also the location of a revocation center. Now, the revocation center basically is a server out there that actually holds a revocation list. I'll talk to you about revocation lists a little later on in this video. But basically, it provides us the location. It's usually a URL that allows us to check to see if that certificate is still valid or if it's been revoked. Now, here's the thing, okay? I want you to understand that a certificate is used both to encrypt files and communications, as well as prove identity of the user or the machine or whatever have you. Okay, so it actually has a dual function. Now, a certificate is generated by a certificate authority server. Now, if you're cool, you call it a CA, if you will. And it's generated by using a private key, which is part of this whole public key infrastructure thing, which I'm going to dip into just a little bit, but not very much because, again, this is a huge topic. But I want to give you a brief idea of what a public and private key is at the very least. So let me go ahead and illustrate this whole key thing real quick. All right. Well, let's say that you have a document over here and you want to take this document and you want to lock it up in a safe. All right. So I take this document, I lock it up into a safe, and I lock it with a private key. All right. Now, in IT, this private key would not be a physical key. It would actually be a bit of code that contains information about the encryption that we just placed onto the file, essentially locking it up in a safe, if you will. Now then, let's say that we have some buddies, all right? And we want our buddies to also be able to access this particular file. Okay, so we need to also give them a key, but we can't give them our private key. Okay, that's ours. So what we're going to do is we're going to generate a public key. Now this public key is still going to be able to open the safe, but we can actually assign this public key to our buddies over here. We can give them essentially copies of it. And this public key is based off of the private key. Okay? Now the public key can open the safe, it can get the file, unencrypt the file, but the public key cannot recreate the private key. All right, so the public keys cannot actually generate the private key that it is based upon. But nevertheless, it gives us a way to encrypt files and also give other people the ability to unencrypt the files and see the files and do stuff with those files, all right? But remember, the private key stays with you, okay? Or if you happens to be a server, that private key may actually stay with a server. All right, so that's just a real quick illustration about public and private keys, and they're generated together, by the way, by a certificate authority. And then we take public keys and we put them into the certificate, okay? And then we don't hand out individual keys, just so you know, we don't hand them out those bits of code to our buddies. We actually hand out certificates that contain our public key, all right, as you see over here. All right, now here's the thing, okay? The certificates, we've talked a little about them. We've talked about how certificates contain keys so we can get to data that's been encrypted. And that part of that certificate also proves our identity. Now those certificates have to come from somewhere, all right? So let's talk about where they come from. First of all, the most basic of basic certificate authorities is a Server 2008, what we call a standalone certificate authority. Now, most of the work that has to be done with a standalone certificate authority is very manual, all right? So if you have a very large organization, this may or may not be the best solution for you. And we have a more powerful option in the Server 2008 Enterprise Certificate Authority. Now, this guy is integrated into Active Directory, so you know there's going to be some additional cool features and some more automation that's going to happen with it. There's one more place where a certificate might come from, and that is a third-party certificate authority, somewhere like VeriSign, or there's a lot of different providers out there. These are oftentimes, especially for large organizations, very expensive, okay? VeriSign, as you know, also offers a lot of SSL certificates for websites and stuff, which is also a version and utilization of a public key infrastructure. Now, certificate authority that generates certificates are called root CAs, okay? Now, a root CA is the top of the food chain in terms of security. It is hopefully a trusted authority that we as users and other computers say, okay, yes, this is the boss, this is the guy who says, yes, this is true, or no, it's not true, okay? So a root CA generates certificates. Now, I want to let you know something, okay? In a very small network, if you want to use certificate services, you could actually use either of these two certificate services options, okay, the standalone certificate authority or the enterprise certificate authority. You could use them by themselves to generate and hand out and to verify users' identities and also to do encryption, okay? Now, certificates that are generated from one of these three types of CAs are then passed on to users, devices, and servers, and so on. And these certificate authorities also provide authentication of a user or organization's identity with use of some kind of online responder services. Okay. And we'll talk about those in just a little bit when we talk about the whole idea of revocation lists. All right, so now let's talk about how you might actually see this implemented in a real network, okay? Let's start off with a standalone certificate authority. A standalone certificate authority is just a Server 2008 machine. It does not have to be part of your domain, okay? It doesn't even have to be a member server. You could take a Server 2008 box, install certificate services on it, and voila, you have a standalone certificate authority. Now, what you're probably going to have is you're going to have subordinate certificate issuer servers, at least one. Okay, you may not have three. I'm just using three for an example, but you're going to be using this as your root CA. Okay, this is going to be your root certificate authority, and then you're actually usually going to have more than one machine doing a lot of the certificate services work. Okay, so you'll create the certificate services with your standalone. Then you'll pass them off onto the other certificate issuing servers. Then what you'll do is you'll take this guy and you'll take him offline. Okay? You don't want a standalone certificate server just to be out there in the open, because someone might get into that particular certificate authority machine and start generating certificates that shouldn't be generated, and selling them on eBay. And yes, it's happened, just so you know. But pretty much all the work on a standalone certificate authority is done manually, okay? If you have a lot of users that are going to require use of certificates to encrypt emails, encrypt files, encrypt communication, you can't just use a standalone certificate authority to auto-enroll users in certificate services, okay? You're going to have to do a lot of the work manually here, and that may not be very much fun, because you're going to have to be creating certificates for every user that's going to require one. And so let's talk about the more powerful option, which is an enterprise certificate authority. This guy actually stays online, and it does need to be highly available. So you're going to use this guy maybe as your root certificate authority. Then you're also going to have additional subordinate certificate servers or issuers. Now, the difference is that when certificates are generated using an enterprise CA, it doesn't go offline. You want it to stay online, because this guy is going to allow you to provide certificates to users in Active Directory using a feature called auto-enrollment. Okay? And once those users have certificates from auto-enrollment, then we can still use that second tier and issue those certificates out using other servers. Okay? We still want to protect our root enterprise certificate authority. Okay? Can you have an enterprise certificate authority just hand out certificates to users and anybody who might need or want them without having to have other subordinate servers? Yes, you can. Is it a good idea? No, because that enterprise certificate generator, that root authority, is then exposed. Okay, so you want to have kind of a front line of protection by using subordinate servers to issue those certificates out. Now, you might even have 2 or 3 tiers of certificate issuing servers, all right? And by the way, a subordinate issuing server is still using Active Directory certificate services. It's just not generating certificates, okay? They're not root certificates. You might hear them called intermediates. You might hear them called several different things, but you might have other certificate servers in subordinate positions doing a lot of the legwork in terms of handing stuff out and also verifying whether or not a certificate is valid. All right, so let's talk a little bit about CRLs, NDASs, and ORs. And yes, there's several acronyms in there. You're like, whoa, hey, those are weird things. What are they? Well, let me see if I can get a little more specific here for you, all right? When a certificate is presented by a user when they attempt to access an encrypted file or try to communicate with a server, whatever it may happens to be, the certificate is checked against a certificate revocation list by a certificate authority to make sure it hasn't been revoked. Now, remember that this is kind of an older way of doing it, because we actually have a new way with Server 2008. We have a service called an online responder, and it can be used in place of a certificate authority in terms of being able to verify. Now, an online responder can't generate and it can't issue certificates. All it does is respond to certificate use. Okay? Now, it doesn't need to check a certificate against an entire revoked certification list. Instead, it just checks to see if a certificate is valid, and it's much faster and it's much more efficient. Now, here's a situation I want you to kind of just stop here and think about in terms of revocation. Let's say you have an employee that goes rogue or just ends up quitting. Well, you want to revoke that employee's certificate so they can't get into sensitive material in your network. Okay? When you revoke a certificate, that revoked certificate goes onto the CRL, Certificate Revocation List. So that way, let's say the employee sneaks in at night or tries to access the network remotely. When they try to use that certificate, our online responders or our certificate authorities will take a look at that certificate and say, hey, you know what, dude? This certificate's been revoked. You can't use it anymore. And will deny access. Okay? So it's a pretty simple concept. Certificate revocation list is just basically people's certificates that we want to deny access to stuff. All right? So that's all it really is. Now I want to talk to you just a minute here about something that's a little bit outside of this particular mess, but I thought I'd throw it in here real quick because there's one more quick vocabulary word I want you to know for the exam, and that is the Network Device Enrollment Service. It's actually a new thing in Server 2008. It allows you to include routers and switches in your PKI hierarchy, public key infrastructure, if you think you really need it. Now, most of the time we don't include routers and switches in our whole public key infrastructure, the whole encryption bit, but if you're in a very highly secure environment, it may not be a bad idea to something to take a look at. All right, now I'm going to give you Active Directory Certificate Services basically in a nutshell, what I really want you to remember from this particular lesson, and then we're going to move on to the next one, okay? Again, this is just a primer on Active Directory Services, so at least you know about what it is and can do further research and further study on it before you take your exam. Active Directory Services allows you to secure just about anything in your network using certificates, and remember that certificates both prove who you are and allow you to encrypt, so that they actually serve two functions. Really, I should say two primary functions. They actually have more functions than just that. But regardless, you will need at least one root certificate authority server to create certificates, but you will probably have other subordinate servers issue them out to protect your root CA from getting abused. Now, regardless of whether you're using a standalone or if you're using an enterprise authority server, one way or the other, you still should have, if you're going to do it right, you really should have an issuing server hand them out, okay? Now, a certificate revocation list will allow for validation of certificates by certificate authority servers when they're used, but I want you to remember that the new online responder service that's available in Active Directory Certificate Services as of Server 2008 is faster and more efficient, okay? So CRLs are great things, don't get me wrong, but you may want to think about implementing online responder services if you want to have a little more faster response. And don't forget this one too, the new Network Device Enrollment Service allows you also to include switches and routers. You can have also those devices use certificates to secure traffic as well. All right, well friends, that's Active Directory Certificate Services in a nutshell. Again, this is just a primer to get you a basic familiarity with them. Before you take the test, you might want to do just a little bit more research and just a little bit more study into this particular arena. So that wraps this one up. Let's go ahead and let's move on to the next one.